A millionaire left his wife with nothing, basking in luxury with his mistress while his ex struggled to rebuild her life. Years later, she returns, stronger, wealthier, and with an agenda of her own. When their paths cross again, the balance of power shifts, and he's forced to confront a past he thought was buried. The room was drenched in gold. Every surface, from the champagne flutes resting on silver trays to the gilded mirrors reflecting the glitter of evening gowns, exuded opulence. The Parker estate, Daniel Parker's pride and joy, sat atop the hills overlooking the city like a king observing his domain. Tonight, the mansion was alive with music, laughter, and the scent of expensive colognes intermingling with floral centerpieces that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Guests wandered through the spacious living room, their conversations layered with boasts disguised as small talk. The crystal chandeliers overhead refracted light into the shimmering champagne glasses below, creating a kaleidoscope of indulgence. And at the center of it all, Daniel Parker stood, a glass of whiskey in hand and a grin plastered across his face. Daniel was the kind of man who thrived on being noticed. His tailored navy suit fit him like a second skin, the subtle sheen of the fabric a testament to its price tag. He carried himself with the air of someone who had always known success, and tonight was no different. His arm rested casually around Alana Harper, the woman who had seamlessly stepped into his life after his divorce. She was everything his ex-wife Evelyn wasn't: bold, attention-grabbing, and unapologetically self-centered. Where Evelyn had been the quiet strength behind his success, Alana was the trophy that proved he had moved on. Alana adjusted her emerald gown, which hugged her figure and drew gazes from every direction. Her diamond earrings sparkled as she tilted her head back and laughed at something Daniel whispered into her ear. She was the picture of indulgence, and she knew it. Daniel wasn't just her partner. He was her access to the world she had always dreamed of. "Daniel," she purred, her perfectly manicured fingers trailing down his arm. "Everyone is staring. You love it, don't you?" He chuckled, his eyes scanning the room. Let them stare. They toasted their glasses, and for a moment, Daniel felt invincible. His business was booming, or so it seemed. His mansion was filled with the city's elite, and his arm candy rivaled any Hollywood starlet. This was the life he had envisioned when he walked away from Evelyn. No responsibilities, no silent accusations, just indulgence. But amidst the glamour, there was an emptiness he couldn't quite ignore. He downed the rest of his whiskey, shaking off the thought before it could take root. "Let's go greet some people," he said, leading Alana toward a group of executives gathered near the grand piano. Meanwhile, across the city, Evelyn Parker sat on the worn leather couch of her one-bedroom apartment, staring at a takeout container she had barely touched. The flickering glow of the small TV cast shadows across the room, but Evelyn paid little attention to the sitcom playing. She had lost her appetite hours ago, the weight of the evening pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. The divorce had been finalized for over a year, but the emotional scars felt fresh. Daniel had moved on so quickly, flaunting Alana in the tabloids as if their years together had been a passing phase. Evelyn had spent most of her marriage building Daniel's success from the background, attending business meetings as his silent partner, managing their household, and ensuring everything ran smoothly while he climbed the corporate ladder. And what had that loyalty earned her? A lonely apartment, dwindling savings, and the echoes of a life she could no longer call her own. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a text from her best friend, Chloe. "Chloe, have you seen the pictures from Daniel's party tonight? They're all over social media." "I'm sorry, Ev." Evelyn's chest tightened as she clicked the link Chloe had sent. The images showed Daniel and Alana posing near the grand staircase of the Parker mansion, their smiles dazzling under the chandelier's glow. In one photo, Daniel leaned in close to whisper something in Alana's ear, and Evelyn could practically hear his laughter that had once been reserved for her. She tossed the phone aside, blinking back tears. Crying wouldn't change anything. It never did. She leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes as memories of her old life swirled in her mind. The lavish dinners, the charity galas, the whispered conversations late at night when Daniel had confided in her about his dreams. They felt like fragments of a life that belonged to someone else. But tonight, something shifted within her. The hurt was still there, but beneath it, a spark of anger ignited. She had given up so much for Daniel, but what had he given her in return? A settlement that barely covered her expenses and the humiliation of seeing her replacement on every magazine cover. Evelyn sat up, her pulse quickening. She wasn't the same woman Daniel had left behind. She couldn't be. If she wanted to survive, no. If she wanted to thrive, she would have to tap into the resilience she had buried under years of compromise. The thought terrified her, but it also fueled her. For the first time in months, she felt something other than sadness, determination. She grabbed a notebook from the coffee table and opened it to a blank page. Her handwriting was neat but forceful as she wrote down her thoughts, each word a promise to herself. Step 1. Get a job that pays more than the bills. Step 2. Learn about investments. Step 3. Never let anyone, especially Daniel, underestimate me again. The list was simple, but it was a start. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stay stuck in the past. She had spent enough nights crying over what she had lost. Now, it was time to focus on what she could gain. Back at the Parker mansion, the night wore on, but Daniel's mood shifted. He stood by the bar, nursing another glass of whiskey as the noise around him faded into the background. Alana was across the room, surrounded by admirers who fawned over her beauty. He should have been happy. This was everything he had wanted, wasn't it? But as he watched Alana throw her head back in laughter, something gnawed at him. It wasn't regret. He wasn't ready to admit that, but it was something close. His mind drifted to Evelyn, to the quiet evenings they had spent talking about their future when success wasn't yet guaranteed but love had been. The memory unsettled him, and he shook his head as if he could physically dispel the thought. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his emails in search of a distraction. But instead of comfort, he found a message from his financial advisor marked urgent. He hesitated before opening it, his heart sinking as he read the contents. Stocks were down, a major deal had fallen through, and investors were growing uneasy. The cracks in his empire were becoming visible. For the first time that night, Daniel felt the weight of everything he had ignored. His lavish lifestyle, his carefree attitude. It was all built on a foundation that was beginning to crumble. He looked around the room, at the people who laughed and drank without a care, and wondered how many of them would still be by his side when things went south. Evelyn's face flashed in his mind again, and this time, he didn't shake it away. Instead, he finished his drink, the bitterness lingering on his tongue. As the night came to a close, Daniel led Alana toward the grand staircase for one final photo. But as the cameras flashed, his smile felt hollow. The party was over, and deep down, he knew it wasn't just for the night. Evelyn, on the other hand, sat at her kitchen table, still clutching the notebook. Her tears had dried, and in their place was a resolve that would become her greatest weapon. If you were in Evelyn's shoes, would you help Daniel or leave him to face the consequences alone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to see how Evelyn's journey unfolds. The glow of the morning sun filtered through the blinds of Evelyn Parker's small apartment, casting stripes of light across the modest furnishings. The place was clean but sparse, a far cry from the luxurious mansion she had once called home. The chipped paint on the walls and the worn carpet beneath her feet were constant reminders of how much her life had changed since the divorce. But this morning, Evelyn wasn't in the mood for self-pity. She sat at the small kitchen table, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee as her mind raced with possibilities. The notebook from the night before lay open in front of her, its pages filled with hastily written ideas and goals. Last night's resolve had carried over into the morning, but determination alone wouldn't be enough. She needed a plan. Her phone buzzed, vibrating against the wooden table. The screen displayed a text from Chloe. "Chloe, you still up for brunch today? I'm buying." Evelyn hesitated before typing her reply. "Evelyn, sure. Where?" The response came quickly, followed by the name of a small cafe downtown. Evelyn finished her coffee and set the mug in the sink, then stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, inspecting her reflection. Dark circles lingered under her eyes, the result of too many sleepless nights spent worrying about her future. Her hair, once perfectly styled for charity galas and business dinners, now hung loosely around her shoulders. With a sigh, she pulled it into a ponytail and applied just enough makeup to make herself feel presentable. As she stepped outside, the crisp autumn air nipped at her cheeks, and she pulled her coat tighter around her. The walk to the cafe wasn't long, but it gave her time to reflect on how different her life had become. Once, she had been the woman who arrived at brunch in a chauffeur-driven car, wearing designer clothes and effortlessly balancing conversations about fashion and philanthropy. Now, she was just another face in the crowd, blending in with the city's hustle and bustle. When she arrived at the cafe, Chloe was already seated at a corner table, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled as Evelyn approached. "There you are," Chloe said, standing to give her a hug. "I ordered us some coffee. You look good." Evelyn smiled politely, though she knew the compliment was meant to reassure her. "Thanks. How've you been?" "Busy," Chloe replied, settling back into her seat. "Work's been crazy, but you know how it is. Enough about me, though. How are you holding up?" Evelyn sighed, stirring a packet of sugar into her coffee. "I'm managing. Barely." Chloe reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know it's been rough, but you're one of the strongest people I know, Ev. You'll figure this out." Evelyn nodded, appreciating the support, but knowing that words alone wouldn't solve her problems. "I started making a list last night," she said, pulling the notebook out of her bag and placing it on the table. "It's a plan to get back on my feet. It's small right now, but it's something." Chloe flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she read. "Investments? I didn't know you were interested in finance." "I wasn't," Evelyn admitted, "but I have to be now. I can't rely on what's left from the settlement forever." Chloe tapped her finger on the table thoughtfully. "You know, I have a friend who works at an investment firm. He could give you some advice." Evelyn's eyes lit up. "Really? I'd appreciate that." "I'll text him," Chloe said, pulling out her phone. "But you know, this isn't just about money, is it? You're trying to prove something to yourself." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Maybe. I don't want to be the woman who was left behind anymore." "You never were," Chloe said firmly. "Daniel's loss was your gain. He just doesn't know it yet." After brunch, Evelyn walked through the city, her thoughts swirling. Chloe's words echoed in her mind, giving her a sense of validation she hadn't realized she needed. She stopped at a bookstore and wandered through the aisles until she found the business section. Her fingers traced the spines of books on finance, entrepreneurship, and investments, finally selecting a few that seemed approachable for someone just starting out. Back home, she set the books on her small desk and began reading. At first, the terminology overwhelmed her. Words like portfolio diversification and asset allocation blurred together, making her question whether she was capable of understanding any of it. But she pushed through, taking notes and highlighting key points. By the time evening fell, Evelyn's notebook was filled with scribbles and diagrams. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted but satisfied. She didn't need to know everything overnight, but she was learning. And for the first time in months, she felt a sense of purpose. The next morning, she met with Chloe's friend, Mark, at a downtown coffee shop. Mark was in his late 30s, with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile that immediately put Evelyn at ease. He listened intently as she explained her situation, nodding thoughtfully as she spoke. "You're on the right track," Mark said, flipping through her notebook. "But investments aren't just about money, they're about strategy. The key is to start small and be patient." Evelyn absorbed his advice, asking questions and jotting down notes. By the end of their meeting, she had a clearer understanding of her next steps. "Thank you," she said, shaking Mark's hand as they stood to leave. "I really appreciate your help." "Anytime," he replied. "And remember, don't be afraid to take risks. Just make sure they're calculated." With renewed confidence, Evelyn returned home and began researching potential investments. She started with small amounts, investing in low-risk stocks and bonds while keeping a close eye on the market. Each day, she tracked her progress, celebrating even the smallest victories. But it wasn't just about the money. As Evelyn immersed herself in the world of finance, she discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer defined by her past or her failed marriage. She was building something new, something that belonged solely to her. Weeks turned into months, and Evelyn's portfolio steadily grew. She met with Mark regularly, seeking guidance and refining her strategy. She attended seminars, networked with other investors, and devoured books on financial management. And with each passing day, she became more confident in her ability to navigate this new world. One evening, as she sat on her couch reviewing her investments, her phone buzzed with a notification. A stock she had invested in had surged, earning her a significant profit. She stared at the screen in disbelief before a smile broke across her face. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a sign that she was on the right path. She set the phone down and leaned back, exhaling deeply. For the first time since the divorce, she felt like she had control over her life. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And in the back of her mind, she knew that this was only the beginning. Daniel Parker had left her with nothing, but she was building something far more valuable. Independence, resilience, and a future that no one could take away. As she closed her notebook for the night, Evelyn whispered to herself, one step at a time. The morning air outside the Parker mansion was crisp, but inside, the atmosphere was stifling. The once grand home, with its polished marble floors and towering ceilings, felt like a prison to Daniel Parker as he sat in his home office, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. His coffee had long gone cold, but he hadn't taken a sip anyway. His gaze was fixed on the rows of red numbers that glared back at him, a vivid reminder that his empire was beginning to crumble. Parker Enterprises, once the shining beacon of his success, was now a house of cards, and the gusts of financial instability were threatening to bring it down. The stock price had dropped significantly over the past month, and investors were pulling out of projects faster than he could make calls to reassure them. His inbox was flooded with emails marked urgent, and his phone vibrated constantly with calls he didn't have the energy to answer. The walls of his office, adorned with awards and framed magazine covers featuring his grinning face, now felt like mocking reminders of what he had achieved and what he was about to lose. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair and ran a hand through his disheveled hair. The sleepless nights were catching up with him, and the weight of his failures pressed down on him like a vice. A soft knock on the door broke through his thoughts, and before he could answer, Alana Harper strutted in. She was dressed in a silk robe, her long blonde hair cascading down her shoulders. The scent of her expensive perfume filled the room, but today, it didn't bring the comfort it once had. "Good morning," she said sweetly, though the sharpness in her gaze hinted that she knew something was wrong. "You didn't come to bed last night." Daniel didn't bother looking up. "I had work to do." Alana sauntered over to his desk, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She perched on the edge of the desk, crossing her legs elegantly. "You've been working a lot lately. Is there something I should know about?" He sighed and closed his laptop, finally meeting her gaze. "We're facing some financial difficulties." She raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm considering selling off assets," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "The investors are nervous, and if I can't turn things around soon, we're looking at major losses." Alana's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, she seemed to be calculating her next move. "So, what's the plan?" "I'm working on it," Daniel replied, though the defeat in his voice was hard to miss. "I have a few meetings scheduled with potential partners who could help stabilize things." Alana leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You better fix this, Daniel. I didn't sign up for a life of luxury just to watch it disappear." Her words stung more than he expected, but he didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, he watched as she stood and walked toward the door, her silk robe trailing behind her like a symbol of the life she had grown accustomed to. Once she was gone, Daniel slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. Alana's loyalty had always been tied to the lifestyle he provided, and deep down, he had always known that. But admitting it now, in the midst of his downfall, was like pouring salt on an open wound. Later that day, Daniel sat in the conference room of Parker Enterprises, surrounded by members of his executive team. The atmosphere was tense, and the hum of the air conditioner was the only sound as they waited for the meeting to begin. The long glass table reflected the grim expressions of the people seated around it. Men and women who had once been eager to ride the wave of Daniel's success, but were now silently contemplating their exit strategies. Daniel cleared his throat and began the meeting, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Let's get straight to the point. We need to cut costs immediately. Non-essential projects will be put on hold, and we're going to start downsizing certain departments. There was a murmur of discomfort, but no one spoke up. They knew better than to challenge him when he was like this. One of the executives, a middle-aged man named Greg, finally broke the silence. What about the merger with Hastings Tech? Is that still on the table? Daniel's jaw tightened. The merger had been his ace in the hole, the deal that was supposed to secure Parker Enterprises' future. But Hastings Tech had recently backed out, citing concerns over the company's declining performance. No, Daniel replied, his voice clipped. They've pulled out. Another wave of murmurs spread through the room, but Daniel raised a hand to silence them. I'm meeting with some potential investors next week. Until then, we need to stay focused. If we can stabilize our cash flow, we'll have a chance to recover. As the meeting adjourned, Daniel remained seated, staring at the empty chairs around the table. The weight of the company's future rested solely on his shoulders, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could carry it. When he returned home that evening, the mansion felt eerily quiet. Alana was nowhere to be found, and the staff had retired for the night. He poured himself a glass of scotch and walked out to the balcony, the cool night air offering a brief reprieve from the suffocating stress. He gazed out at the city lights, his thoughts drifting to Evelyn. He hadn't spoken to her since the divorce, but memories of her were becoming harder to ignore. Evelyn had been his grounding force, the person who had believed in him when his dreams were still just that, dreams. She had supported him through every challenge, every sleepless night, and every failure. And how had he repaid her? By trading her for a life of luxury and superficial connections. He took a long sip of his scotch, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. Part of him wanted to call her, to apologize for everything, but he knew it was too late. Evelyn had moved on, and he had no right to drag her back into the mess he had created. Just then, his phone buzzed with a text message from Alana. Alana, staying at the hotel tonight. Don't wait up. He stared at the message, the emptiness in his chest expanding. Even Alana, the woman who had been his constant companion since the divorce, was slipping away. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. He had built his life on a foundation of temporary pleasures, and now that foundation was collapsing. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to find a solution. He spent hours making calls, negotiating with suppliers, and drafting proposals for new partnerships. But as the day wore on, the weight of his failures pressed down on him harder. His assistant knocked on the door, poking her head inside. Mr. Parker, you have a meeting with Mr. Langston from the board in 15 minutes. Daniel nodded, though the mention of Langston sent a chill down his spine. Langston was known for being ruthless when it came to protecting the company's interests, and Daniel had a feeling this meeting wouldn't be pleasant. When Langston entered the office, his expression was unreadable. He took a seat across from Daniel and folded his hands neatly on the desk. We need to talk about the company's future, Langston said, his tone calm but firm. The board is concerned. I'm handling it, Daniel replied, though the confidence in his voice was forced. Langston leaned forward slightly. I hope so, but you should know. If things don't improve soon, we'll have no choice but to explore other options, including bringing in an outside investor. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. An outside investor would mean losing control, something he had fought hard to avoid. But Langston's gaze didn't waver, and Daniel knew the board was serious. I understand, Daniel said quietly. As Langston left the office, Daniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a dark cloud. His mind raced, searching for solutions, but one thought kept pushing its way to the forefront. He needed help. And for the first time, he considered that the person who could help him might be the woman he had left behind. The evening sky over the city was painted in hues of amber and violet, the fading sunlight casting long shadows over the glass skyscrapers that glimmered like monuments to ambition. Evelyn Parker stood on the balcony of her modest apartment, sipping tea as the cool breeze tugged gently at her hair. The warmth of the cup in her hands was comforting, but it was the spreadsheet on her tablet that kept her thoughts occupied. She scrolled through the rows of data, her gaze sharpening with every column of profit margins and investment growth. What had once been small, cautious investments had blossomed into something far more promising. It wasn't a fortune, not yet, but it was enough to prove that her strategy was working. Evelyn had spent months carefully studying market trends, diversifying her portfolio, and taking calculated risks. She had become more than just a woman picking up the pieces of her life. She was a woman building a future. Her phone buzzed on the small metal table beside her, interrupting her focus. It was a message from her mentor, Mr. Langston. Langston, good job with the real estate investment. Proud of you. Let's discuss next steps tomorrow. A smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Langston had been her guiding light when she first dipped her toes into the world of finance. He was the one who had encouraged her to think beyond survival and aim for success. They had met at a networking event months earlier, back when Evelyn had barely understood the basics of investing. She had shown up with nothing but determination and a notepad, and Langston, an older man with a keen eye for potential, had taken notice. Evelyn responded with a simple "thank you" before setting the phone down. She wasn't the same woman Langston had met at that event, fumbling her way through investment jargon. Now, she could hold her own in discussions with industry experts, and she was beginning to attract attention from people who saw her as more than just a wealthy man's ex-wife. Inside, her small desk was cluttered with research papers, notebooks, and sticky notes filled with reminders about upcoming meetings. The clutter didn't bother her. It was a sign of progress. She had spent too long living in pristine, empty spaces that reflected her stagnant marriage. Now, her environment felt alive, buzzing with the energy of someone on the move. She sat down and opened her laptop, scanning her emails. One in particular caught her attention: an invitation to a private investors conference in New York. The event was invitation only, limited to individuals and firms with significant influence in the financial world. The fact that Evelyn had been invited was proof of how far she had come. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her response. Attending the conference could open doors to new partnerships and opportunities, but it also meant stepping into a world where her past might catch up with her. People would recognize her as Daniel Parker's ex-wife, the woman who had quietly disappeared from the social scene after their divorce. She could already picture the whispers and judgmental glances. But then she remembered the night she had stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, telling herself that she wouldn't be defined by her past. She had made a promise that night, a promise to herself. And if there was one thing Evelyn Parker had learned in the past year, it was that promises to oneself were the hardest, but most important, to keep. With a deep breath, she typed out her reply, accepting the invitation. The following day, Evelyn met with Langston at his downtown office, a sleek space filled with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city below. The hum of traffic was distant, almost soothing, as Evelyn sat across from Langston, who was reviewing her latest financial reports. "You've done well," Langston said, tapping his pen against the edge of the report. "The real estate investment was a smart move. You bought low and sold at the right time. I couldn't have done it without your advice," Evelyn replied. Langston leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Don't sell yourself short. You've taken my advice and turned it into action. Not everyone can do that." Evelyn felt a surge of pride but kept her composure. "What do you think about expanding into tech investments?" "I've been researching some up-and-coming companies." Langston nodded thoughtfully. "Tech is volatile, but it can be incredibly rewarding if you play it right. Tell me what you've found." She opened her tablet and pulled up a presentation she had prepared, walking him through her analysis of several startups with promising potential. Langston listened intently, occasionally asking questions or offering insights. By the end of the discussion, he was nodding in approval. "Let's move forward with this," he said. "But remember, patience is key. Don't let short-term fluctuations shake your confidence." "I won't," Evelyn assured him. As they wrapped up the meeting, Langston paused. his expression shifting to something more serious. "You've built a solid foundation, Evelyn, but if you really want to make a lasting impact, you'll need to think bigger. Have you considered entering the corporate world as more than just an investor?" She tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I'm talking about acquiring companies, not just investing in them," Langston said. "Becoming a major shareholder, getting a seat at the table, and having a say in how things are run." The idea sent a thrill down her spine. She had spent so long reacting to the world around her that the thought of taking control, of steering her own ship, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I've thought about it," she admitted, "but I'm not sure if I'm ready." "You're more ready than you think," Langston replied. "And I have a feeling you know exactly which company you'd like to start with." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was implying, but she wasn't ready to say it aloud. Not yet. Still, the thought lingered in her mind as she left the office and stepped out onto the busy street below. That evening, Evelyn sat on her couch, a glass of wine in hand, as she watched the city lights twinkle through the window. Langston's words echoed in her head. "You know exactly which company you'd like to start with." Of course she did. Parker Enterprises. The company she had helped build during her marriage, only to watch it slip through her fingers when Daniel took full control. It was the same company now teetering on the brink of collapse, according to the financial news she had been following. The thought of returning to Parker Enterprises wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her legacy. She had poured years of her life into that company, and if Daniel had driven it into the ground, then she had every right to pick up the pieces. But it wasn't just about proving herself to him or to the world. It was about proving to herself that she could rise above everything that had tried to break her. She set her glass down and picked up her phone, dialing Langston's number. "I'm ready," she said when he answered. Langston didn't need clarification. "Good. I'll help you strategize. But remember, this isn't just a business move. It's personal." "I know," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. "But I'm not the same woman who walked away with nothing. This time, I'm taking control." As she hung up the phone, Evelyn felt a sense of clarity wash over her. The fear and uncertainty that had once gripped her were gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. She wasn't coming back as the woman Daniel had dismissed. She was coming back as a force to be reckoned with. The city skyline loomed ominously through the expansive glass windows of Daniel Parker's corner office. Normally, the view of gleaming skyscrapers and bustling streets provided him with a sense of power, a daily reminder of the empire he had built brick by brick. But today, the panorama only deepened the pit in his stomach. He could see everything, yet control over anything seemed to be slipping away. Daniel sat behind his polished mahogany desk, the room eerily quiet except for the occasional hum of the central air system. The documents in front of him, a financial report detailing the latest quarterly losses, might as well have been a death sentence. Parker Enterprises was hemorrhaging money. His investments had failed to yield returns. A major contract with a government agency had fallen through, and investors were withdrawing their funds as if his company carried a contagion. His assistant, Claire, entered quietly, carrying a tablet and a worried expression. She placed it on the desk and shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Parker, you have a meeting with the board in 15 minutes. Daniel didn't look up. He could sense the concern radiating from her, and he didn't have the energy to pretend that everything was fine. "Thanks, Claire," he said, his voice flat. "I'll be there." She hesitated at the door, as if she wanted to say something more, but thought better of it and left without another word. As the door clicked shut, Daniel leaned back in his chair and exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His reflection in the window stared back at him, dark circles under his eyes, a suit that seemed a little looser than it had been a few months ago, and a man who no longer recognized himself. 15 minutes later, he entered the boardroom, a spacious, modern space with sleek black furniture and walls lined with digital displays showing stock prices and company updates. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken accusations. The board members, a mix of middle-aged men and women in tailored suits, watched him as he took his seat at the head of the table. Langston, one of the more senior board members, cleared his throat and began the meeting. "Daniel, I think we can all agree that things are not looking good." Daniel clenched his jaw but kept his composure. I'm aware of the situation, Langston. That's why I've been working around the clock to secure new investors. Langston leaned forward, his hands clasped together. And have you had any success? There was a long pause before Daniel answered. I have a few leads. One of the younger board members, a woman named Melissa, interjected. We need more than leads, Daniel. The stock has dropped 35% in the last quarter, and our competitors are already circling like vultures. If we don't secure funding soon, Parker Enterprises will be at risk of a hostile takeover. The words stung more than they should have. The thought of losing the company he had built was unbearable, but the reality was setting in. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising wave of panic. I'm doing everything I can. Langston's gaze didn't waver. We understand that, but the board has a responsibility to protect the company. If you can't turn this around within the next month, we'll be forced to consider bringing in outside investors. Outside investors was a euphemism for losing control. Daniel knew that once an external party gained significant shares, his role as CEO would be reduced to a formality, if not eliminated entirely. I need time, Daniel said. His voice edged with desperation. Langston leaned back, crossing his arms. Then I suggest you use what little time you have wisely. The meeting ended with no concrete solutions, just the weight of expectations resting heavily on Daniel's shoulders. As he returned to his office, he passed Claire, who handed him a list of upcoming meetings. You have a call scheduled with Mr. Hastings from the investment firm at 3 p.m., she said. And Mr. Langston requested an update on the new proposals by tomorrow morning. Daniel took the list without acknowledging her. He shut the office door behind him, poured himself a glass of scotch from the bar cart in the corner, and sank into his chair. The amber liquid burned as it slid down his throat, but the warmth was fleeting. His gaze fell on the framed photo on his desk, an old picture of him and Evelyn on their honeymoon in Santorini. They were standing on a balcony overlooking the Aegean Sea, their faces glowing with the excitement of newlywed bliss. He hadn't thought about that trip in years, but now, the memory surfaced like an old wound. Evelyn had been his anchor back then, the one person who believed in him unconditionally. But he had taken that belief for granted, assuming it would always be there. When he left her, he had thought he was leaving behind a chapter of his life that no longer served him. Now, he realized he had left behind more than just a marriage. He had left behind the stability and wisdom she had provided. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. The caller ID displayed Alana's name. He hesitated before answering. Hey, he said, his voice subdued. I'm at the hotel, she said, her tone indifferent. Just wanted to check in. I'm fine, Daniel lied. There was a pause on the other end before Alana spoke again. You sure? You've seemed distant. I've been busy, he replied, running a hand through his hair. The company's going through a rough patch. Another pause. Well, I hope you figure it out, she said. Let me know if you want to meet up later. As the call ended, Daniel realized how empty her words felt. Alana didn't understand the gravity of what he was facing, nor did she seem particularly interested in offering support. Their relationship had always been built on the highs of success, and now that those highs were fading, he wasn't sure what was left between them. He opened his laptop and began drafting emails to potential investors, each message more urgent than the last. But the responses trickled in slowly, and most of them weren't encouraging. Hours passed, and as the sun set, casting the office in a dim, orange glow, Daniel felt the weight of failure pressing down on him harder than ever. At 3 p.m., he dialed into the call with Mr. Hastings, his last hope for the day. The line connected, and Hastings's voice came through, firm but polite. Daniel, I've reviewed the proposal you sent, Hastings said. I'll be honest, it's risky. I understand that, Daniel replied. But with the right backing, we can turn things around. There was a long pause, and Daniel could hear the faint sound of Hastings tapping a pen against his desk. I'm willing to consider it, Hastings finally said. But I need to know you have a contingency plan in place. If the board turns on you, what's your exit strategy? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Daniel didn't have an exit strategy, at least not one that wouldn't cost him everything. I'll figure it out, he said, though the words felt hollow. After the call ended, Daniel sat in silence, the weight of Hastings's warning sinking in. He needed a solution, and fast. His mind raced through options, but only one stood out, a thought he had been avoiding for weeks. Evelyn. She had always been the problem solver, the one who could think 3 steps ahead. If anyone could help him now, it was her. But reaching out to Evelyn meant swallowing his pride, admitting that he had failed without her. It wasn't just a business move, it was personal. Still, as Daniel stared out at the darkening city skyline, he knew that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He picked up his phone and dialed the number he hadn't called in over a year. It rang twice before going to voicemail. Daniel hesitated, then left a message. "Evelyn, it's me. I need to talk. It's important." The sun filtered through the high-rise office windows, casting golden streaks of light across the polished floor of a downtown conference room. Evelyn Parker stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the city below. She had been here before, downtown boardrooms with their long glass tables and leather chairs, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't here as a wife or silent supporter. She was here as the decision-maker, the one holding all the cards. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, poised, confident, and sharp. Her navy blue dress fit her perfectly, paired with a simple gold necklace that gleamed in the sunlight. There was no sign of the woman who had walked away from this world with nothing. The Evelyn Parker standing here today had rebuilt herself, one small investment at a time, and today was the culmination of that journey. Behind her, the door opened, and the sound of leather shoes against the hardwood floor echoed softly. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She recognized that stride, the controlled rhythm of someone who carried himself like a man who had conquered the world. Daniel Parker. Evelyn exhaled slowly, keeping her posture steady as she turned to face him. He was dressed in a tailored gray suit, but unlike the Daniel she had once known, there was a subtle weariness in his eyes. The confident smirk that had once been his trademark was absent, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung between them like a heavy curtain, weighted with unspoken history. Evelyn let the moment stretch, watching him shift slightly under her gaze. "Evelyn," Daniel said finally, his voice softer than she remembered. "Thanks for agreeing to meet." She gestured toward the long conference table. "Let's get to it then." Daniel hesitated before taking a seat, setting his briefcase on the table. He opened it and pulled out a folder, sliding it toward her. "These are the latest financial reports. I wanted you to see the numbers for yourself." Evelyn remained standing, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the folder. "I don't need to see them," she said. "I've already done my research." Daniel blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You have?" "Of course." She pulled out her own tablet, tapping the screen to display the same reports in more detail. "I've been following Parker Enterprises closely. I know about the declining stock prices, the failed merger, and the investors pulling out. I also know that you're running out of time." Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then you know why I'm here." Evelyn smiled faintly, but there was no warmth behind it. "I do." She circled the table slowly, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Daniel watched her, the tension in his shoulders growing with each step she took. When she finally sat across from him, her posture was relaxed, but her gaze was anything but. "I'll be honest, Daniel," she said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "When I heard you were looking for investors, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was how quickly your empire began to collapse." He flinched, the words cutting deeper than she had intended. For a moment, she considered softening her tone, but then she remembered the nights she had spent crying, the humiliation of being replaced, and the long road she had traveled to get here. "I didn't call you to dig up the past," Daniel said, his voice strained. "I called because I need your help." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the armrest. "And you think I'm the right person to help you?" "You are," he said without hesitation. "You know this company better than anyone. You helped build it." Her heart tightened at the acknowledgement, but she refused to let it show. "And yet, you were the one who took credit for it." Daniel's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his suit jacket. I made mistakes. I know that. Evelyn studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of the arrogance that had once defined him. There was none. He looked tired, worn down by the weight of his failures. But that wasn't enough to sway her. I'm willing to consider investing, she said, her voice measured. But there will be conditions. Daniel looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. I'm listening. She leaned forward, her gaze locking onto his. First, I want controlling shares. If I'm going to put my money into this company, I want to have a say in how it's run. He nodded slowly, though the tension in his jaw was evident. I expected that. Second, she continued, I want your resignation as a... Daniel's breath hitched, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse. But then he exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. If that's what it takes to save the company, I'll step down. The admission took her by surprise. She had expected more resistance, a fight to protect the position he had clung to for so long. But the Daniel sitting across from her wasn't the same man who had walked out of their marriage with his head held high. Who would you propose as my replacement? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I already have someone in mind, Evelyn replied, sliding a file across the table. A capable executive who understands both the financial and operational sides of the business. Daniel opened the file, scanning the contents before nodding. You've thought this through. Of course I have, she said. This isn't just a business decision for me. It's personal. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. I know. The weight of those two words hung between them, and for a moment, the years of hurt and betrayal threatened to resurface. But Evelyn pushed them down, reminding herself that this wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was hers. There's one more condition, she added. You'll stay on as a consultant during the transition period. I'll need your insight, but you won't have the final say. Daniel nodded, though the defeat in his posture was impossible to miss. Understood. Evelyn stood, gathering her tablet and documents. I'll have my legal team draft the agreement. You'll have it by tomorrow. As she made her way toward the door, Daniel called after her. Evelyn. She paused but didn't turn around. What? I know you have every reason to hate me, he said softly. But thank you. You didn't have to do this. For the first time, Evelyn's composure wavered. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath before replying. I'm not doing this for you, Daniel. I'm doing it for the company, and for myself. With that, she left the room, her heels echoing down the corridor like the drumbeat of victory. But as she stepped into the elevator and the doors closed behind her, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, her hands trembling slightly. She had won, but the battle had taken its toll. As the elevator descended, Evelyn looked at her reflection in the mirrored walls and whispered to herself, You've come too far to stop now. The city awaited her below, vibrant and full of possibilities. And for the first time in years, Evelyn Parker felt ready to seize them. Evelyn Parker strode confidently into the Parker Enterprises building, a place that had once felt like a distant memory but was now her battleground. The click of her heels echoed through the marble lobby, drawing the attention of employees who whispered among themselves as they watched her pass. Some recognized her immediately, the ex-wife of their former boss, the woman who had seemingly vanished after the divorce. Others only knew her from the headlines announcing her return as the company's largest investor. But Evelyn wasn't here to relive the past. She was here to rewrite the future. In the elevator, she adjusted the cuff of her tailored black blazer, her heart steady despite the weight of what was about to happen. The meeting with the board was scheduled for 9 a.m., and she intended to make an impression they wouldn't forget. The glowing numbers on the elevator panel ticked upward, and with each floor, her resolve hardened. When the doors slid open, she was greeted by Claire, Daniel's former assistant. Claire's expression flickered between surprise and admiration. Good morning, Miss Parker, she said, her voice respectful but curious. Good morning, Claire, Evelyn replied with a warm smile. It's good to see you again. Claire nodded and gestured toward the boardroom. They're waiting for you. Evelyn entered the room with the grace of someone who belonged there, her gaze sweeping across the table where the board members sat. Daniel was at the far end, his posture stiff but his expression neutral. He had agreed to her terms, but that didn't mean he was comfortable with them. "Good morning, everyone," Evelyn said, taking her seat at the head of the table. The shift in power was subtle but unmistakable. She was no longer an outsider seeking approval. She was the one setting the agenda. Langston, who had been one of Daniel's strongest allies, cleared his throat and addressed the room. "As you all know, Parker Enterprises has faced significant challenges in recent months. But with Ms. Parker's investment and leadership, we're positioned to stabilize the company and move forward." Evelyn nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I won't sugarcoat this. We're not out of the woods yet, but we have a clear path to recovery. The first step is restructuring the leadership team." Her words hung in the air, and all eyes turned to Daniel. He sat silently, his hands folded on the table. It was a strange sight for Evelyn. This man who had once dominated every room he entered now seemed subdued, as if the weight of his decisions had finally caught up to him. "Daniel has agreed to step down as CEO," Evelyn continued, her voice steady. "But he will remain with the company as a consultant during the transition. I've appointed Rachel Bennett as the interim CEO. She's an experienced executive with a strong background in corporate turnarounds." The board members murmured their approval, though some exchanged wary glances. They had known Daniel for years, and the idea of someone else steering the ship was unsettling. But Evelyn had done her homework. Rachel Bennett was more than qualified to handle the job, and Evelyn had made sure to secure the board's support before this meeting. "Rachel will be joining us shortly," Evelyn said. "In the meantime, I'd like to go over the key initiatives we'll be implementing over the next quarter." As she spoke, she outlined a series of strategic moves designed to cut costs, boost revenue, and regain investor confidence. She emphasized innovation and efficiency, two areas that Parker Enterprises had neglected under Daniel's leadership. Her presentation was clear, concise, and backed by data, exactly what the board needed to see. When she finished, Langston leaned back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully. "This plan is ambitious, but I believe it's exactly what we need." "I agree," Melissa chimed in. "It's refreshing to see a proactive approach." Evelyn glanced at Daniel, who had remained silent throughout the discussion. His gaze was fixed on the table, but when he sensed her eyes on him, he looked up. There was something unreadable in his expression, a mix of resignation, regret, and perhaps a hint of admiration. "Do you have anything to add, Daniel?" Evelyn asked, keeping her tone professional. He hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "No, I trust your judgment." The words were simple, but coming from Daniel, they carried weight. Evelyn acknowledged his response with a small nod before turning her attention back to the board. "Then let's get to work," she said. Later that afternoon, Evelyn stood by the large window in her new office, watching the city below. The space had once belonged to Daniel, but it had been cleared out and redecorated to reflect her style, minimalist and modern, with soft touches of warmth. The bookshelves were filled with business manuals and personal mementos, a blend of who she had been and who she was becoming. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said. Daniel entered, his hands in his pockets. He looked around the office, his gaze lingering on the subtle changes. "It suits you," he said. "Thank you." Evelyn gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Have a seat." He complied, sitting awkwardly as if the weight of the conversation ahead was already pressing down on him. Evelyn sat across from him, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "I wanted to check in," he said. "Make sure everything's going smoothly." "So far, so good," she replied. "Rachel's settling in, and the board is optimistic." Daniel nodded, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "I meant what I said earlier. I trust your judgment." Evelyn studied him carefully. "Why now, Daniel? You fought so hard to keep control, but the moment you lost it, you didn't resist." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I know when I've been beaten, and because I know you're the only one who can fix this." The vulnerability in his voice was unexpected, and for a moment, Evelyn saw a glimpse of the man she had once loved. But that man was buried beneath years of mistakes and choices that had driven them apart. "I'm not here to fix you, Daniel," she said softly. "I'm here to fix the company." "I know," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But for what it's worth, I'm sorry. For everything." Evelyn's throat tightened, but she forced herself to remain composed. Apologies don't change the past. No, Daniel admitted. But maybe they can help with the future. Silence settled between them, heavy and unresolved. Evelyn stood, signaling that the conversation was over. You should focus on your role as a consultant. There's still a lot of work to be done. Daniel rose to his feet, hesitating for a moment before extending his hand. Good luck, Evelyn. She shook his hand firmly, her grip conveying both strength and finality. You too, Daniel. As he left her office, Evelyn returned to the window, her reflection blending with the cityscape beyond. The weight of her victory was bittersweet, but it was hers nonetheless. She had taken control, not just of the company, but of her life. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm glow, Evelyn knew that this was only the beginning of her rise. The air inside the conference room was unusually still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Evelyn Parker sat at the head of the long glass table, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her laptop as she watched the final slide of her presentation fade from the screen. Around her, board members scribbled notes and whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking between her and the financial projections she had just presented. She had done it. Parker Enterprises was no longer teetering on the edge of collapse. Over the past few months, Evelyn's leadership had sparked a complete turnaround. Revenue streams were stabilizing, new contracts had been secured, and investor confidence was returning. The company wasn't out of the woods yet, but it was no longer drowning. It was swimming towards safer shores, and Evelyn was holding the compass. Langston cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. This is impressive, Evelyn. The board unanimously agrees that your strategy has been instrumental in getting us here. A wave of relief washed over her, but she kept her expression neutral. Thank you, Langston. But we still have work to do. Melissa, another board member, leaned forward. True, but let's take a moment to acknowledge how far we've come. The projections for the next quarter look promising. Evelyn nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. She wasn't someone who celebrated prematurely. There was always another challenge on the horizon, and she intended to be ready for it. After the meeting adjourned, Evelyn gathered her documents and headed back to her office. The familiar rhythm of her heels clicking against the marble floor was comforting, a reminder of the power she now wielded. But beneath that power, there was a lingering tension, a sense that something was unresolved, and she knew exactly what it was. As she entered her office, she found Daniel Parker waiting for her, sitting on the leather couch by the window. His tie was loosened, and the sleeves of his crisp white shirt were rolled up, exposing forearms that carried the faint tan of someone who had spent too many hours outside, away from the confines of corporate life. He looked different, yet familiar. A man at a crossroads. I figured you'd be busy, he said, standing as she entered. I am, Evelyn replied, placing her laptop on the desk. But I assume you're here for a reason. He offered a faint smile, the kind that held equal parts nostalgia and regret. You always did know how to cut to the chase. Evelyn folded her arms, leaning against the edge of her desk. I don't have time for games, Daniel. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Fair enough. I wanted to congratulate you on the turnaround. You've done what I couldn't. Her gaze softened, but only slightly. This isn't about outdoing you. It's about saving the company. I know, he said, stepping closer. But you didn't just save the company. You saved me. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened, but she maintained her composure. I didn't do this for you. Daniel smiled again, but there was no trace of sarcasm. I know that too. But you did something I couldn't do for myself. You showed me how far I'd fallen. For a moment, the air between them crackled with unresolved emotions. Memories of their life together flooded Evelyn's mind. The late-night brainstorming sessions, the way he used to hold her hand under the dinner table during business events, the promises they had made when success was still a distant dream. But those memories were tinged with betrayal, and she wasn't ready to forgive them. You lost sight of what mattered, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I did, Daniel admitted. I thought success meant more than it did, and I hurt you in the process. Evelyn's throat tightened. You didn't just hurt me, Daniel. You broke me. The vulnerability in her confession surprised even her, but she didn't regret saying it. She had spent too long burying those feelings, pretending they didn't exist. But here, in this room, with the man who had once meant everything to her, they were impossible to ignore. I know, he said, his voice cracking, and I've been trying to figure out how to make it right. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You can't undo what's already been done. I'm not asking for that, he replied quickly. I'm asking for a second chance, not as your husband, but as someone who wants to be a better person. Evelyn stared at him, searching his face for any sign of manipulation or hidden motives. But all she saw was sincerity. Daniel Parker, the man who had once been untouchable, was standing in front of her stripped of his pride, asking for something she wasn't sure she could give. I don't know if I can trust you again, she said, her voice trembling. I don't expect you to trust me overnight, he said, but let me prove it to you. Let me show you that I've changed. Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn turned toward the window, her gaze fixed on the city below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the skyline. The view reminded her of how far she had come, how much she had endured to get here. I'm not the woman you left behind, she said finally. I've changed too. I can see that, Daniel replied softly, and I'm proud of you. The sincerity in his voice caused tears to prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had cried enough over Daniel Parker. She wouldn't let those tears define her anymore. I need time, she said, turning to face him. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'll give you all the time you need. Evelyn exhaled, the weight of the conversation lifting slightly. If you're serious about change, start by proving it in your work. Help me rebuild this company the right way. I will, he promised. I won't let you down again. She extended her hand, and when Daniel took it, she felt a spark of something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't anger either. It was hope, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. After Daniel left her office, Evelyn sat at her desk, her fingers tracing the edge of the notebook she had kept since the beginning of her journey. The same notebook that had once held a list of survival goals now contained plans for expansion, innovation, and growth. She flipped to the last page, where she had written a single phrase months ago. Take back what's yours. With a pen in hand, she crossed it out and replaced it with something new. Build something no one can take away. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a sense of calm washing over her. She had spent years living in the shadow of her past, but now she was ready to move forward. And if Daniel truly intended to change, she would let him prove it, not for her sake, but for his own. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in twilight, Evelyn Parker smiled. The world was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. She was no longer the woman waiting for someone to rescue her. She was the woman who had rescued herself,